This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This episode, I really didn't expect that we'd still be kind of getting into critical race theory, but it honestly is so meaty and juicy that it's kind of spilled over into 3 episodes. Because, you know, what critical race theory is really talking about is race and power and culture. And I hope y'all have enjoyed listening, but I've really tried to unpack that in the multiple ways and facets that we experience that in our lives. So if you haven't listened to part 1 and part 2 of this kōrero, I do encourage you to do that. Not that you need to listen to the previous 2 episodes to follow this one, but I really think the last couple of episodes, we have really put the groundwork in. And we've really laid out critical race theory, you know, where it came from, its core ideas, how it really started in American law, but how it applies and travels globally. And so we kind of spoke about it in what critical race theory looks like in Aotearoa. So we brought up the greats, Moana Jackson, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, and we also spoke about Te Tiriti. We've also kind of spoken about how critical race theory, it unfolds in our personal lives, like dating, desirability, politics, pop culture. And what I really want to get into this episode is talking about the critiques around critical race theory and also how we can apply it, especially in a time where we really are rethinking like what community, social cohesion, equity looks like. So I'm going to start this episode talking, borrowing words and ideas from Aisha Akanbi. And I think the way that their brain works is just straight up 10 out of 10, period. But I think what they have to say really relates to critical race theory. So, and it is bold, but Aisha is bold. So what Aisha said basically was that when we reduce every human interaction to a transaction of power, when we frame every personal choice, like who we love, what we watch, how we speak, in terms of systemic oppression, we risk something. And that something is compassion and relationship. And we risk the very solidarity that justice requires. And, you know, I think it's just really relevant to this whole kōrero around critical race theory. And so that's where I want to start today, because I think what we need to do with critical race theory is not just stop at this, you know, that kind of structural analysis, but it's to really play with it and to take it beyond the framework, right? To test it, to complicate it, to ask, you know, where is it incomplete? Where does it overreach? What do we need to add to it? And I think critiques of critical race theory are not to be ignored. They need to be taken quite seriously, because the framework that is critical race theory, it needs to be stressed and strengthened by that critique. And I'm hoping that this is how this episode reads, is that it's like a stress test with the aim to strengthen, but a stress test with love. So let's get into it. So let's who is Aisha Akanbi, actually, if you haven't even heard of them? They are a British Nigerian fashion stylist and cultural commentator. And they had this video essay in, I think it was pre-COVID, like 2019-ish, called The Problem with Wokeness. And it went viral. And it it was great and excellent and lots of food for thought, but it kind of went viral. In some ways, it kind of became viral in a really weird way, because that video essay, it got picked up by conservative media, and the read and take on that was weird by conservative media, which was Black woman who agrees with us, which is never what Aishat said. And Homegirl's being very explicit about this. She's not anti-racism. She's anti-performance, anti-performative justice. And, you know, and she's also kind of, the way that I read it was, she's anti that version of progressive politics that has, you know, become more concerned with ideological purity than just genuine human transformation. So I really want to be precise about what Aisha has said, because I think precision is important here. And so the whole argument is that there is a tendency in progressive spaces, particularly online, and particularly in certain academic and activist communities, you know, to transform, you know, when we are critiquing and analyzing a systemic injustice and turning that into a set of personal moral requirements. So to turn, like, for example, just to make this a bit more real, because I feel like I just said a whole lot of big words back to back just there. Look, so for example, you know, talking about systemic racism, and changing it into your personal choices are constantly under scrutiny, and the wrong ones make you a bad person, and the vocabulary you use determines your virtue, and disagreement is itself evidence of your complicity in this system. And I think that really creates a culture of fear rather than a culture of curiosity. It closes down, you know, that genuine, vulnerable kōrero where people can actually change. Because I feel like people can only really hear and sit with hard things when they feel safe enough to receive them. And, you know, if there's a cultural of like ideological purity and a culture of moral surveillance, that does not equate to safety. All it does is produce performance, right? And it's really easy to reward that performance. And so, you know, it's really, you know, really easy to learn to say how to say the right thing, so that actually challenging or changing, you know, the beliefs behind that. And so it kind of gets to a point where like that level of superficial performance is kind of a distraction of transformation. And another key part to Aishat's whole point is reducing people to their identity communities or categories, for lack of a better word, even with good intentions, even in the name of justice, can itself be dehumanizing when we relate to each other primarily as like, not just people, just like instances of like race, gender, sexuality, class, and religion, rather than like fully human beings that are specific and complicated and, you know, irreducible. I feel like, you know, we lose something essential there. And I think that's the very thing that, you know, whatever kaupapa you're part of, that part of justice is realizing the full humanity of each person. One thing that I fully agree with Aishat's critique analysis is that performance and transformation are very different things. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why I struggle with social media. I think I've said it before on the show before. It's something that I am trying to work on. but yeah, this is definitely one of the reasons why. And, progressive spaces can become so focused on performance that they kind of slow down or get in the way of transformation. If you think about it, like the dynamics of activist or organizing spaces, the call outs, the pile-ins, the vocabulary gatekeeping, the hierarchies of, it's like suffering Olympics, the hierarchies of suffering and credibility is very real. And it can drive away people who might otherwise be genuine allies. And they burn out the people who committed to the work the most. And they can also create communities of insider knowledge rather than communities of genuine inclusion. I think another thing that Aisha is correct about is that compassion is not a luxury. Compassion is the mechanism through which people change. And if there's any kind of analysis or, breakdown, takedown of any system of oppression, and if it's done in a way that doesn't produce compassion, I don't think that that lack of compassion, it doesn't lead to any kind of transformation, right? If there isn't any compassion, it can, create impatience with people at different stages of understanding, pleasure in being correct rather than investment in being effective. And when I say that, I want to put this disclaimer out there that sometimes this is also a complicated thing. As I'm saying this out loud, I am aware that there are so many horrible things going on in the world where if you don't know what's going on, that's definitely, that's on you, boo. We have access to information. There are avenues to not just automatically accept and feed off our usual mainstream information or media sources. And so, when you're so deep in the kaupapa and the wrongs and rights are just so clear, when people are behind in that awareness or understanding, I can understand the frustrations there. I just want to put that out there, that I do understand that this is complicated. But I'm just saying, for long-term transformation, for having more people on board, compassion is very much a required part of this, analysis of a system of oppression. That compassion is really, really important. Otherwise, people are left behind. I think that's what I'm trying to say, but also acknowledging that this is really, really complicated. And also another thing that Aisha is correct about is that, identities that we carry are not the totality of who we are. Yes, I am Amal. I am a Muslim Black woman. And obviously these identities shape my experience in just really profound ways. But also beyond that identity, I am just Amal, I'm a person who, I'm a wife, I am a daughter, I am a sister, a friend. I'm a nerd. I love reading books. I love punny jokes, bad puns. I am someone who has so many contradictions in my one being. And it's just so complicated. So when I think about identity, I just immediately think of Amal first, which is, these identities are really important to me, but I'm more than just that too. So I think, yes, it's important that, the identities we carry are not the totality of who we are. And I think the intersectionality is the best thing that we've got that honors that complexity. But intersectionality at its worst can take those identities and kind of turn it into some 2D grid that just isn't fully human either. I think there are also some things that I want to tease out from what Aisha has said as well. But I want to do it in a way where I bring the same care that she brings to her critiques, because that's what any kind of hard conversation deserves. So, Aisha's critique of the performance of wokeness. Yes. Is it sharp? Yes. And is it true? Yes. But I also think there's the risk there of becoming, and not on purpose, but just by the logic of how it gets received, it becomes an argument against the structural analysis itself. And those are very different things. The problem with performative anti-racism is not that the underlying analysis is wrong. It's that the analysis has been detached from its purpose, which is genuine transformation. So, in other words, like when anti-racism says, racism is not great, and not just like in a personal level, like structural, systemic racism, not good. That analysis is not wrong. But that analysis becomes something else when it is detached from genuine transformation. And so I think the solution here is not to abandon the analysis or the structural lens, but it's that the lens in which we are viewing this system and the analysis there is to be used with compassion and community that Akanbi is really asking for, because that is where the transformation lies. And I think another really thing that's just glaringly obvious to me is that what Aishat is proposing, and kind of so a framework associated with that doesn't fully account for the fact that people who bear the cost of structural racism, they don't get to opt out of that conversation because it's uncomfortable. For example, Black women navigating hiring discrimination doesn't have the luxury of declining to name it because naming it might make someone else feel surveilled. A Māori student whose knowledge systems are systematically devalued in school doesn't get to choose to not be affected because calling it structural sounds too politicized. And so, I think, that call for having a more compassionate, less living on the moral high ground level type of kōrero is easier to make from a position where your daily life isn't shaped by the inequalities being named. And it kind of was what I was talking about before. Like, if you are directly impacted by it, there is this sense of like, well, I'm not here to educate you. We need to get into the work, because look at what's happening. It's clear as day when it really impacts your daily life, and when it hurts in the most painful and sensitive areas in your life. And so, I'm not saying that it's, that compassion automatically means let's slow down and be gentle, because for some people in some communities, that urgency is not optional. And I think also, it's very easy to critique performative justice, but it shouldn't be an excuse for inaction. One of the most effective strategies of backlash politics is to use the critiques of activist overreach as reasons to dismiss the initial concern entirely. So, for example, the way that you're asking is too aggressive, so I won't address what you're asking about, is a power move. And so I'm not saying that that's what Aishat is arguing, but you can see how it is read that way. And so I think holding, that distinction and that difference matters. The next thing that I really want to talk about is reform or transform. There's a question that kind of sits and it's just kind of bubbling under the surface with every conversation about racial justice. And it is a question that critical race theory is surprisingly quite chill about, which I find really interesting, because are we trying to reform the existing system, or are we trying to build something fundamentally different? And it's not a new debate, right? Like, this has been around for a really long time. If we go back to the context in which critical race theory came from, these are the kinds of conversations that were happening a lot in the civil rights movement, between the politics of like integration and inclusion on one hand, and then on the other end, the politics of self-determination and racial restructuring on the other. It's kind of like a spectrum of Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, which is kind of, I suppose, a simplified version of that most of us kind of have learned. Both of them were legends, and also very complicated, more complicated than what, the binary allows. King's politics by 1967 and 68 were far more radical than, what the sanitized version gets credit for. And that same kōrero is happening here in Aotearoa when we're thinking about tangata whenua and honouring te tiriti. And that kind of conversation is really relevant here, because that's kind of where critical race theory has emerged from, right? Like, when the civil rights movement had kind of won the formal legal equality, which was the reform goal, that formal equality, it didn't actually mean that there was like substantive equality. And so, it could suggest that critical race theory is more about transformation. But a lot of the framework actually just stays within the existing legal and institutional frameworks. And argues for better enforcement and fair interpretation and a more honest history, which is more in line with reform than transformation. And then, we have Moana Jackson, who very much was a transformationist. And he was very clear about this. He was not interested in making the colonial system fairer. He was interested in building a different constitutional arrangement that wasn't built on colonial systems' foundations. And so this question, or this kōrero, is very relevant and very alive here in Aotearoa, particularly in 2026. Because, with this current government, we have watched them, actively dismantle what little structural progress had been made. And so, from a reformist perspective, it is a really heartbreaking setback that needs to be reversed by political means that are available to us, which is voting, lobbying, litigating. But from a transformationist perspective, this is like confirmation of what the argument has always been, which is a system that depends on the goodwill of those in power to accommodate those without it is not a system that produces justice. It produces conditional inclusion, conditional meaning that it can be taken away. And, I kind of want to sit with something uncomfortable here, which is Derek Bell's late career position on racial progress in America. And Bell was one of the founders of critical race theory, the first tenured Black professor at Harvard Law School, a man who resigned his tenured position twice in protest of Harvard's failure to hire women of color. And so Bell in the 1990s began arguing something that, a lot of his surrounding colleagues found just a bit too bleak to accept. And he made this argument that racism in American society could not be corrected, that it was permanent, foundational, that the legal and social system was racist in ways that and that it was structured around a racial hierarchy which would continuously reassert themselves because too many people in positions of power had too much invested in maintaining that history. And so, in the first episode, we kind of spoke about this, and it was kind of like a gentler version of this argument. But the darker version is what Bell called racial realism. And that, what he was proposing was that Black Americans needed to proceed or to work with the assumption that the struggle against racism would not be won, with a few caveats, not in the foreseeable future and not through this existing system. And so the job or the work ahead is not to pursue victory, but to pursue integrity, to resist, to bear witness, to maintain dignity and solidarity in the face of a permanent condition. And that is hella hard to hear, right? Because it sounds like a level of despair that is so paralyzing, because it's essentially just like, well, if the system cannot be changed, why try? And so I think Bell's answer to that was not on the basis of winning, i.e., eliminating that racism on every level, institutional, systemic, but the practice of resistance, the act of refusing to accept injustice as normal. So that means naming it clearly, of building communities that honor the humanity of people the system devalues. That in itself has value, regardless of whether it produces the change you're working through. And that idea has been around as well. It's kind of a Black political thought that goes all the way back to Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, also to those unnamed people who kind of kept the culture and language alive in slavery times. And it's, you resist because resistance is what it means to be fully human, not because you expect to be rewarded for it. And I think just hearing all of this, it's both moving and troubling at the same time, because for me personally, I want to believe that things can change. And I do think things can change, but I also want to acknowledge that political thought that change without understanding how it gets reversed is change that won't last. And we've also seen that too, where we have seen too much of progress being reversed. And I think, if we're thinking beyond the critical race theory framework, I think the Indigenous framework, Moana Jackson's framework, kaupapa Māori, and the decolonial tradition, it kind of offers something that critical race theory alone can't quite provide. Because critical race theory is about the rights and recognition of people within the existing political system. It argues that just any marginalized community have been denied rights and recognition, and they are owed that within the system, and that system must be reformed or transformed to correct that denial. But the Indigenous framework asks a different question. It asks not how do we get what we are owed within the existing system, but should we recognize the system's authority to decide what we are owed at all? And so when answering that question, it's not talking about inclusion, it's talking about sovereignty. Tino rangatiratanga. And so for the rights of peoples to govern themselves according to their own laws, values, and relationships to the land. And I think this is a more radical position than critical race theory. Because, and it's more radical for many reasons, but I think, it has implications that even people who consider themselves to be progressive might find uncomfortable, which is, if Indigenous sovereignty is genuine, if it means the right to make decisions about land and resources and law and governance without having those decisions filtered through or constrained by the colonial state, then it asks settlers to give up things that feel very concrete, and not just bad attitudes, not just holding on to negative stereotypes, not just acknowledgements of history, but actual power, actual authority, actual land. And I think this is why Moana Jackson kept returning to the question of, imagination, because he knew that transformation that he was calling for was it's genuinely difficult to conceptualize from within our current system's logic, right? It asks us to imagine a different kind of political reality, not just reforming the existing one. And imagination is hard when the existing system is all you've ever known. So, for all of us kind of engaging with this, it's not an abstract question. Me personally, I think it's the most live political question in this country right now. What does genuine treaty partnership look like? What would co-governance actually mean if it were taken seriously? What would it mean to truly honor the promise of tino rangatiratanga? And I think these questions, I'm not saying that I have the answers to them, but I think these are questions that are real, that have real contested material answers, and sitting with them honestly rather than retreating to comfortable positions, whatever your comfortable position may be. I'm not here to tell you that there is only one comfortable position. I think that can manifest in different ways, is what, this episode, this podcast is here for. So I'm going to let y'all sit with that. The other thing that I really wanted to spend some time talking about is internal tensions, the things that we don't always say aloud, because this is going to be a little bit painful to talk about, but it is important, and the discomfort of what we're talking about is not reason to avoid it. Anti-Blackness is not exclusively a white phenomenon. It exists within Latino communities, South Asian communities, East Asian communities, Arab communities, Pacifica communities. And if you don't believe what I'm saying, it's backed up in the research too. And it's something that I know because I am a Black person who has experienced it. There's research out there that says, how immigrant communities of color, sometimes achieve social mobility by distancing themselves from Blackness and performing proximity to whiteness. And this isn't done consciously. Most of the time it is learned because, we all out here trying to survive in this system. And I think this plays out here in Aotearoa in very complex ways as well, between Māori and Pacifica communities, between Indigenous communities and migrant communities of color. I mean, as I'm saying this, I think there was racist remarks made about our Indian community. It was just not okay. And the thing is, if we're going to talk about, because I think critical race theory is all about race, and if we are talking about race, we need to be honest about how anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous racism, it operates within communities of color, and it's not just between communities and the white dominant culture. And I think, again, this is where the intersectionality can really help us out here, right? Which is multiple systems of oppression doesn't just compound within individuals, right? It also manifests within communities as internal hierarchies. And also our girl Bell Hooks was very explicit about this, which is you cannot fight external oppression while reproducing its logics or that same system or that same oppression internally. And so I think the integrity of a kaupapa depends on the willingness to look inwards as well. Another critique of critical race theory that I think that also has a lot of genuine substance, I do want to spend some time just at least mentioning it in this episode, is the class critique. There are some scholars, including people who are very committed to racial justice, argue that critical race theory become a framework that benefits middle class and professional class people of color more than it benefits poor or working class people of color. That the diversity, equity, and inclusion that has grown up around the language of critical race theory and the corporate and academic settings is more oriented, or it speaks more to, educated people of color existing in elite institutions than challenging the material conditions that produce poverty across racial lines. I think we need to talk about both, because race and class are really, really important. We need both racial analysis and class analysis. And I think another key part is that we need to understand how they interact. Because, there's a version of anti-racism that produces Black CEOs and more diverse corporate boards without even touching wage theft, housing insecurity, mass incarceration, or educational underfunding. And to me, that's not liberation. That's just an integration of a small number of people into a system that still is fundamentally unjust. And I'm going to borrow the words of Barbara Ransbury, a historian and activist, because she just wrote about this in an excellent manner. The measure of justice is not how many people of color are at the top of existing hierarchies. The measure is what happens to the people at the bottom. And any framework that loses sight of that substitutes representation at elite levels for material transformation of conditions at the bottom, they have been captured by the system it was trying to critique. And I think this really connects to something that Moana Jackson said quite often. The goal of decolonization is not to produce a Māori elite that operates according to colonial logic. It is to restore conditions in which Māori communities can flourish according to their own values. Mana whenua, mana motuhake, self-determination, not better representation. And I think another thing that I think about when I think about critical race theory and its critiques and its application is, and this is a bit more nuanced, but the relationship between acknowledging historical and ongoing trauma and building the kind of agency and resilience that communities need to survive and thrive. Critical race theory is many things, but one of the things that it is a framework for understanding the harms that structural racism produces. And I think a really important thing about critical race theory is that it insists that those harms be named, they be taken seriously, and they are not to be minimized or explained away. And you know what? That insistence is correct and it's necessary. And I think another thing that comes with that, and it's something that, I have heard anecdotally in my own life from people of all walks of life, right? Whether it's educators working with young people or mental health practitioners working in or with communities of color, is that there is a version of that racial harm narrative that if it's the only story told, it can low-key produce a sense of fixed victimhood that doesn't serve people's flourishing. And this is something that I think my father was very aware of, raising Black Somali kids here in Aotearoa, navigating a Western education system where we're always going to be, it's always going to be assumed that we are not intelligent or not going to put in the work for our education. And it's something that I have seen in my community. And I think if I could speak to my community, especially the younger ones, is that you need to understand that the history has shaped our circumstances. And it is important to have experience of racism named and validated and not dismissed, but it's also really important to have stories of resistance and creativity and brilliance and agency. You need to see yourself as inheritors of just extraordinariness, not just as people marked by the violence. And I think both things are true and both matter at the same time. And it's not one of those things that it's like right or wrong. It's not saying, focus on what's good and stop complaining. It's saying that liberation, requires imagination of a different future, not just analysis of the existing system. And you know what? This analysis is really important, but it's not sufficient on its own. We need imagination of what we're building towards, the visions of beloved community, of transformation, of tino rangatiratanga, of seeing our people as extraordinary. That needs to be there as well. And I'm going to leave that there. What I really want to talk about, especially when it comes to applying critical race theory, is where it gets practical and complicated. When we initially started talking about critical race theory, I was talking about how there's this manufactured panic over critical race theories in school. If there's any kind of language that involves race, diversity, or discomfort, it's treated like it's a literal bomb. And I don't want to rehash that out, but what I want to do is talk about that, the real and substantive questions about race and education that these, the fake debates or the noise kind of tends to drown out. And I think the real debate about critical race theory and education is, what does it look like to teach history honestly? What does it look like to design a curriculum that reflects the actual diversity of who is in the classroom? And not just demographically, right? But in terms of whose knowledge systems, whose literatures, whose history is treated as worth knowing. And this is something that's very relevant here in Aotearoa, the debate around Māori language and culture in schools, Te Kura Kaupapa Māori schools, which is full immersion, were established not as an experiment in diversity, but as an act of survival, right? Te reo was being lost, and the mainstream education system was not producing te reo frequency or fluency. So, you know what? Communities organized, lobbied, fought, and eventually built this alternative. And those schools have produced extraordinary results, not just in language preservation, but their outcomes just across the board. And I think this is critical race theory's that counter storytelling principle and action in the most literal sense, right? An education system built on the knowledge, values, and language of a community, rather than requiring that community to assimilate into someone else's framework. And this current government is actively cutting that funding and support for Māori and Pacifica language education. And so what I think, you know, like critical race theory, if used well, can be a really important tool in helping us talk about this, because it is really, really relevant here to Aotearoa, especially in an election year where we will be having these kind of conversations around what world we want to live in, how we want the world to look like. So really, really important. And I kind of wanted to finish this episode talking about what does it look like to imagine differently. And this is something that I want to be really honest about. I think critical race theory is better at diagnosis than producing a vision. I think critical race theory is an extraordinarily powerful set of tools for identifying how racial inequality is produced and maintained, but it's not prescriptive when it comes to talking about what an alternative looks like. And I don't think that's a fatal flaw. Diagnosis has value in itself because you can't treat what you haven't named. But it does leave a gap. And I'm not here to say that this is how this gap should be filled. This is how it should be done. I don't have all of the answers. But I think that gap gets filled in different ways for different people. You know, for some, it is that gap is filled by a very liberal democratic vision, you know, a system where the existing institutions work as they're supposed to work, where law is genuinely enforced equally, where historical discrimination is actively remedied through policy. For others, that gap is filled with something that can't be achieved by better enforcement of the existing system. It's envisioning different structures, different relationships to land, different relationships to political authority, different ways of just organizing life. For some, that gap is filled with a practice rather than policy, that practice being beloved community, you know, the everyday building of ways of being together that really embody dignity and honor the complexity of every person, and that refuse to reproduce the hierarchies of a larger system, that are grounded in love as a political commitment, not just a sentiment, feeling, vibe thing. And you know what? Maybe the gap will be filled by a combination of all the things and more that I haven't listed, right? I don't think these visions are mutually exclusive. I think that they can work at different scales and different time frames. And but if I'm really taking anything away from this episode, I think the everyday work is more aligned with Bell Hook's vision, which is beloved community and being in genuine community, showing up for each other, you know, refuse to let the hierarchies of the system determine the quality of care that you offer the people around you. And I really want to get quite specific about this because beloved community, it does sound hella abstract. And just even that language of using that language, it makes it sound like, you know, you can just even using that language, it sounds like you're doing something. You know, it's really easy to nod to that, but not do anything with it. But in practice, I think this is what it looks like. It looks like intergenerational knowledge transfer done deliberately. Sitting with your elders, asking questions about what was lost, what was held onto, carrying that knowledge forward, not as if they're as a curated museum exhibition, but as living things. And, you know, as a Somali person who is part of the diaspora, that is something that is not optional for me. It is survival, especially now that I'm getting older and thinking about, you know, starting a family with my husband, Arthur. It's that knowledge is so special, and it's knowledge that has often been threatened by assimilation or displacement, which makes it, you know, even more important to hold on to. You know, it looks like building economic solidarity that isn't dependent on the goodwill of dominant institutions. Community land trusts, mutual finance, like in my culture we have Hagbad. It kind of functions outside of the banking system. It looks like cooperative housing, shared childcare, you know, things that our communities have always done when formal systems weren't really there for us. It looks like building media and cultural production that doesn't require the approval of the dominant system to reach your own community. You know, community radio, independent publishing, not to toot my own horn, but podcasts like this one. You know, I think this kind of infrastructure allows stories to travel without passing through the gatekeepers who have decided whose stories are worth telling. You know, it looks like political education that is rooted in community and orientated towards action, not just this weird intellectual exploration, which is important, but, you know, it's not everything. And it's really easy to get caught up in that. I think performative activism really gets caught up in that. But the systemic building of knowledge and capacity in communities, which then allows communities to engage with power on their own terms. You know, like if we think about Moana Jackson's Hui across the motu, that was political education. It was also an act of love. You know, it looks like grace, the willingness to be in community with people at different stages of understanding, the patience to have the same conversation more than once, the courage to be honest when things go wrong without burning the relationship, the capacity to disagree about important things and remain in community anyway. I think this is the hardest one, to be honest. And again, I know that real life is a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. I really want to put this disclaimer out there. So there's a lot more that I can say, but I think that is where I'm going to wrap up with this conversation. And I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part kōrero on critical race theory. You know, I think critical race theory is the structural question that we should reach to as our first reflex. You know, is there a pattern here? Who else is experiencing this? What structural conditions produce this outcome? And not because that explanation is always correct, but it's always the one that's kind of overlooked, and overlooking it kind of reproduces the problem. But don't let that be your ending point. Use that as your starting point and your jumping point. So yeah, I hope that you have enjoyed the past 3 episodes on critical race theory. I hope this just listening and engaging with this kōrero has been its own form of action. You know, that thinking together honestly across difference and doubt is part of how the world changes. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one. Ka kite anō.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.